After the Civil War, many of the soldiers didn't come back marching from war. Matter of fact, the United States lost 620,000 total on both sides. President Lincoln being the last casualty. He died, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth 5 days after the Civil War ended. So Vice President Johnson, Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, would take over as president, and not without controversy. Johnson was kind of had a reputation for being a drunk and a hard guy to get along with, and there were many plans on how to deal with the South. One of those plans was called the 10% plan, where as soon as 10% of the Southerners would take a loyalty oath to the U.S. government, then they could be pardoned and they'd have full voting rights again. The economy was destroyed. If you looked at the infrastructure in the South, the bridges, roads, cities were damaged, in many cases beyond repair. It would take forever to, in a decade or more, to get back to normal. The cotton crop was destroyed, and one of the bright spots eventually is going to be Birmingham, Alabama, where it became the center of the steel business, which rivaled Pittsburgh. Sometimes Birmingham was called the Pittsburgh of the South. When it came to African American rights, things would change also. Because of 3 amendments that were passed during this time, it would change the opportunities that black Americans would have. But it would take a while, of course, before equality would ever get close to what it is. 13th Amendment would end slavery. The 14th Amendment would give all anybody born in the United States would be U.S. citizens, which included many of the slaves that were born here. And the 15th Amendment gave all African American males over 21 the right to vote. Even though they had the right to vote, there were still restrictions. There was still intimidation. Often the African Americans and poor whites had to pay a poll tax to vote, and many couldn't afford it, so therefore they didn't vote. There were literacy tests. If you couldn't read or write, you lost your right to vote. Eventually, there was a lot of intimidation. The Ku Klux Klan rose to power during this time, and the Klan was even big yet in the 1920s. You had, even in Texas, you had the majority of white males were actually members of the Klan. In many cases, not active members, but they were members. And in fact, people often forget that in the 1920s, at the State Fair in Dallas, there was actually a Ku Klux Klan Day, and 100,000 people actually showed up that day dressed in their Klan garb. Reconstruction would eventually come to an end. In 1877, when the Union troops would finally pull out of the South, they had been there patrolling and keeping things in order for the better part of 12 years after the Civil War. The election of 1876 rolled around, and in that case, in that election, it was Hayes would run against Tilden, Sam Tilden from New York. Kind of an odd election because Tilden would get the popular vote, Hayes would get the electoral numbers, but nobody got the majority of electoral votes. So they set up a commission, and it was called the Compromise of 1877. And what happened was Hayes would become president and agree to withdraw Yankee troops from the South, and Reconstruction would end. Something to think about as we close down the first video clip here. We had Also at this time, even though there was 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and things were moving in a direction of equality, it would take a long time for us to see the benefits of that. In the 1890s, there was a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a man who was actually 7/8 white, 1/8 black, and he was riding on a railroad car in New Orleans, and he was kicked off, told to go to the black section. I guess you could call Homer Plessy the Rosa Parks of the 19th century. And the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in this case, ruled against Plessy in the Plessy-Ferguson case and said that as long as facilities were equal, it's okay if they're separate. And that became the law and the idea until the 1950s and 60s, when the Supreme Court struck down the separate but equal policy with the Civil Rights Act and some of the other things that led up to it that we'll get into later down the road. But when you look at those situations, something to think about is are we still segregated today? You know, here we are in the 21st century. We have black families that are, of course, doing a lot better than they did back after the Civil War economically. But we look at how the schools have become integrated since the 1950s and 60s. But yet at the same time, we look at schools, public schools, and we see segregation within integrated schools. We see black kids who hang out with black kids, white kids who hang out with white kids. Of course, you could say, well, that's a choice that they make, consciously maybe, or unconsciously, who knows. But we still can go to schools public schools where 95% of the kids are white, and we can go to public schools where 95% of the kids are black. Many neighborhoods are the same way, where people live. So are we still living in a segregated society today, even though the Civil War was supposed to end that? Something to think about.